Well, welcome to all of you who have tuned in today. My name is Jamar Nellums, and I'm with the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research at the American Institutes for Research. And today we're speaking with Toni Saia, a community action coordinator for a private nonprofit organization that's operated by and for people with disabilities, and it's part of the national network of Centers for Independent Living. Toni is pursuing her PhD as well in counseling education and supervision. And today we'll continue the conversation about disability research and why it matters. So Toni, we're really glad that you've joined us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So we always start off with asking folks if they would share a little bit about themselves and some of the key areas, both professionally and personally, where research plays a role for you.
Well, I think, of course, as a PhD student, right, research is kind of always lingering. Research is how we advance the field and how we inform decisions that we make for the field. So in that sense, research is part of my everyday life, but I think research is also important as a member of the disability community because I think, again, research helps inform and make decisions, and I think the more research is done, the more access parents of children with disabilities, people with disabilities, allies, then will have information about the disability experience. So I think research continues to keep the disability community afloat, and to advance and continue and kind of learn. And I don't think research always has to be, the goal doesn't have to be cure, but the goal has to be, what can we do and what can we do better than what we're doing right now. So
could you talk a little bit more about that? So you mentioned some of the roles is that it provides information, it provides access, it creates allies or can help also provide knowledge for our allies. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or maybe even provide one or two examples of how that's played out for you?
I think historically, right, a lot of people with disabilities weren't a part of research. We were kind of people that we didn't really have a voice at the table when it came to research. But I think, for example, I do a lot of research on active learning techniques for people with disabilities and universal design. So not just creating an accommodation for the person with a disability, but creating your learning space to accommodate all. So for example, in the classes that I teach, none of my exams are timed because I don't want the student with a disability to have a different experience or have to go somewhere else to take the exam. So I have all the exams on time so that every student, regardless of disability or ability, can have the same opportunity and experience. And I think if it wasn't for people doing research on universal design and designing things beyond the individual level, I don't think I would be able to implement that in the classroom environment.
Excellent, very helpful. And so let's move from that setting back to the setting you mentioned earlier, being a PhD candidate. How, if any way, does your approach to research for that purpose differ than for the example that you just provided us, if it does differ?
So I think doing research, I like to do a lot of qualitative research because I think with disability, a number is just a number. And when you know one person with a disability, you literally know one person with a disability. And that's not enough for research. Saying 10% of people with cerebral palsy experience this means absolutely nothing versus speaking to a person with any disability. And so I think my approach to it is, and very consistent with my beliefs as the community action coordinator, is that the individual knows their experience best. So even as a person with a disability, I'm not going to come into my interview and be like, no, actually, that's not the way it goes. I trust that my interviewee, has the experience, and even if it differs from mine. And I think a lot of times that's why people with disabilities are excluded from research, because we have professionals that want to tell people with disabilities what it's like to have a disability, and they don't understand the experience. And so I think I tend to make sure that my research methods and what I'm doing is consistent for all people. So for example, if I am interviewing somebody that uses a wheelchair, I will not do a 2-hour interview, because I've already considered that they might need to weight shift. And so if they have to weight shift in the middle of my interview, how's that going to make them feel? It's going to change the dynamic of the relationship, right? Because now in the middle of the interview, you have to go. And then by the time you come back, who knows if you remember what you talked about or the feelings associated with. So that's just one example, but I'm considering the needs at the forefront. And I think that's what's lacking a lot of the time, is that when a person with a disability is being interviewed but is part of research, a lot of the time it's like, oh, let me meet Toni or figure it out, and then we can make accommodations, instead of thinking about disability at the forefront. And this way, my interviewee doesn't even have to say, Toni, I'm not going to be able to do that interview because it's too long for me to sit in my chair for one sitting.
So you've just mentioned quite a few distinct things that researchers could actually consider and do slightly differently than how they may in fact be doing it now. Is there anything else that you think researchers should keep in mind, whether it's something that they should keep doing because it works from a disability research perspective, or that they should either do differently, like some of the strategies that you just mentioned?
So first I want to say I think language is super important. I think how the person discusses disability is going to make the interviewee feel comfortable or uncomfortable. So for example, for me, as a disabled person, I identify as a disabled person. So I am using not person first language, right? Which is everything that we hear in research. Oh, you must use person first language. And I'm not saying person first language is bad, but if you see a person with a disability and they're using language like disabled woman, they shouldn't be corrected in their own interview. Because, for example, I use disabled woman as an identifier, as a political identity. So I'm not just willy-nilly using it. I'm using it to tell you that disability is part of my identity and something that I'm proud of, that doesn't need to be separate from. I'm not saying everybody has that experience, but I think sometimes in research, we put language on other people and that sways what they have to say. And when I've been interviewed for things, I'm very turned off when somebody's telling me how to describe my experience, whether it's right or wrong. I mean, it's mine. And so one thing I think that we do very well, which we should continue to do, is get information from the person with a disability. Stop going outside to find the information. The person with the experience has the information. And I think we do that well. I think especially in the last 10 to 15 years, I think we're doing a lot better actually getting individuals with disabilities to describe their experiences, opposed to interviewing the principal of an elementary school to say, how does people with disabilities fit in your program? It's like, of course he's going to tell you they fit, right? Because if he didn't, then we would say you're discriminating, right? So of course he's going to say, oh yeah, they fit perfectly. So I think that's what we're doing well.
Great. Oh, that's excellent. And so thinking about that from both, you have this researcher hat, which is not every person's hat. And then you have your professional hat, and it sounds like sometimes the two meet. Where would you recommend people go to actually get research, to find quality research, to find the type of research that you're talking about, so that whether it's legitimate or it's something that they know they can use or feel comfortable using? What would you recommend to people?
So number one, I think to be in the environment. So sometimes I think we focus a lot on the interviews, but the people are never in the environment. So if you're going to do research in schools and how disability plays a role, you need to be in the school to see how it plays out. Another thing I think is lean on your organizations like Centers for Independent Living who provide services to not one person with a disability, but to all disabilities, not just people with visual impairments, not just people that are deaf, people with all types of disabilities. Because I think that's what also happens in research. We're so boxed into this criteria that we find out information that's only pertinent to one group, and then you can't really generalize it to everything. While I still think that information is important, I think that we need to widen our criterion base, and to do that, right, you need resources. And Centers for Independent Living serve everybody. I mean, they serve people that self-identify. We don't ask for documentation. And I think that that's also a nice thing, because now we're looking at you. We don't really care what your diagnosis is, you know? And I think that's a great resource for a lot of researchers, and a lot of researchers don't really go in the community. They stay, whether, like at my university, a lot of research happens at the university. We're hardly ever in the community. And it's like you said about higher education, it's like higher education experiences of a person with a disability is going to be widely different from a person with a disability in the community, right? They're doing different things. So I think sometimes we have to expand our higher education bubble. Although I think our bubble is nice, I think we need to expand, because we're missing a whole lot of people. Being in the environment, I think, is key.
That's key. Excellent. So this is incredibly helpful. We're hoping it's helpful for folks who are both researchers and those who are non-researchers. But before we conclude, is there anything else that you would want to put out about why disability matters, particularly disability research, why disability research matters, why it's important, how whether we're a researcher or a non-researcher, how we can or should use it, particularly from a disability rights perspective, an advocacy perspective, an activist perspective?
It's important because we need to be the advocates. And so if we are not informed, even if we're not the ones doing the research, and it doesn't always mean, you know, doing something like a protest, but we need to be advocates. We need to be a voice at that table. And the only way we're going to be a voice at that table is if we're doing things and we're staying up to par, right? Nobody wants the toy from Toys R Us that's 10 years old. Everyone wants the one that's coming out. And so we need to stay at the table, and we need not to be afraid to share our opinions and say when things are wrong. So I think a lot of times with disability, we accept anything because we're just so happy to be a part of the conversation. And we're not likely to advocate and say, you know what, your language is really offending me. And so we need to be that advocate and be that voice, because there are people that do not have that voice for a variety of different circumstances, and we need not to be afraid to be advocates. And I think that that's the bottom line. In any role, you're a teacher, you're a researcher, you're a student, it doesn't matter if you have the disability experience or not, we need to advocate. And if we don't advocate, nobody else will.
Toni, on that note, we want to thank you so much for being able to join us today. And we're really glad that you've been able to provide insight and your perspective to this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you to everyone for attending this video cast in our series on disability research, Why It Matters. After you viewed all 3 discussions in the series, we encourage you to fill out an evaluation form by following the link at the bottom of the slide. We'll email it to all who registered, and you'll also be able to find this link on our webcast information pages at www.ktdrr.org. As you know, this evaluation serves to help us plan our future events. In addition, you may also ask your questions to our presenters in this series. And please be sure to include your email address if you would like to directly receive responses back to your questions. Before we close, we'd like to thank the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, also known as NIDLR, for supporting our activities in these video, webcasts, and other events.